So we've been studying this book of Revelation, and it's been this really powerful, moving book. And I've had so many people talk to me about, hey, this book, I'm no longer scared of it. I'm no longer thinking about fire and brimstone when I'm reading it. I'm thinking about the Lamb. The book actually has hope and meaning to me now. And I think the whole reason that maybe people are seeing it now is because we're beginning to understand Revelation a little bit heavier. We're beginning to see that maybe this book actually offers a glimpse of not just what evil looks like, but a full picture of who Jesus is. So as we've been reading, we've been studying about what this literature really was. It's called apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature is not concerned with like future events and blood moons and all that stuff. Not about prediction. Apocalyptic literature was not predictive. It was actually resistance literature about messages of hope and messages of challenge. And so that's the whole point of Revelation, is it's not predicting some future event far off. It's actually giving messages of hope and challenge to God's people then, and challenges to us now. And so the question is, how will we respond now to beastly empires and beastly people when they want us to live a certain way that is totally against the way God called us to live? So again, we understand that this book, it doesn't end in fire. We believe this world is actually going somewhere good. And so it ends with this compelling story of everything being made new. Creation is restored. All things are made new. No more crying, no more pain, no more brokenness. We have a sense of shalom. Nothing missing, nothing broken. That's where we're heading. So as we've been doing these studies, a lot of you have said, Pastor Tony, that image looks a lot like this image. And that image looks a lot like this image. And I don't understand, because aren't these supposed to be a sequence of events that will happen? And so as we've been studying, we've been understanding that no, this book, Revelation, it's not about a sequence of events. It's not about a prediction of how things are going to happen exactly this and this and this. Because apocalyptic literature, what it does is it shows us a picture, it shows us an image of the same concept, and then it'll show another image, same concept, but wrapped differently. And so here's a picture of that idea, here's another picture of that same idea, and before you know it, you pull back and you see this huge mosaic, and all the pictures are there to create an image. And so in the book of Revelation, what we've understood is that chapters 2 and 3, they describe who Jesus is and who his church is. And in the light of that, we understand the struggle that they're going through. And again, the whole purpose of Revelation is to give a message of hope and challenge for God's people. And so then when we get to chapters 4 and 5, we understand that it's all about the throne. And so what we did is we looked at Emperor Domitian, and we looked at his throne. Because his throne, what John is doing is he's comparing the two. He's saying Emperor Domitian's throne looks like this, but the Lamb's throne looks like this. And that's why the Lamb is worthy of worship. And so again, he's comparing and contrasting, just like he did in chapters 2 and 3. And then when you begin to get into the next couple chapters, we begin to see these trumpets. And we begin to understand the consequences of following beastly empires. This is what it looks like if you go that direction. And so God, through John, gives a message of warning, but also a message of hope. And then as we continued on, we understood, okay, John's also describing here, he shows us what God's church looks like through the two witnesses. And so in the two witnesses, we see that even when the dragon is trying to hurt God's people, and when he's sending all of these terrible plagues and all these things on God's people still survive. And so the dragon looks worse and worse and worse, because evil, we understand, evil, the consequences of evil are worse and worse and worse. If I decide to go this direction and follow sin, my life is going to get worse and worse and worse. And so John describes sin, beastly empires. He describes them worse and worse and worse until we understand that following beastly living is appalling. And Jesus he describes as bigger and more beautiful and more compelling. And so the whole book of Revelation is that. It's one compelling story of the Lamb over and over and over again. And when we see the Lamb as super compelling and beautiful, we understand how disgusting and gross beastly empires are. And we understand that we don't get life through violence, greed, and oppression. Life is found there with the Lamb, through giving of oneself, through forgiving one's enemies, loving your enemies. We find out that that's where true life comes from. And at the very end of Revelation, all those patterns and all those pictures, we'll be able to see those clearly and step back. And when we step back, we'll see the whole picture of who the Lamb is. And it'll be made up of all these tiny pictures from every chapter. And that will cause God's people, us, to fall down and worship the Lamb. And so as we've been moving through this book of Revelation here in this room, I've begun to see some of the reactions from Christians, the reactions to violence and some of the shootings that have taken place in Charleston and other places, the police brutality, all of it. I've begun to watch how Christians respond. And I've seen on Facebook and various news, whether it's Fox, NBC, CBS, whatever it is, I've begun to see a lot of Christians. Their responses are kind of almost just two main responses. I see one of them as this. A lot of Christians will say, well, then we should pick up arms. We should protect ourselves. Use violence against violence. And then I see another response, and it's this. A lot of Christians will say this. Well, Jesus, he will exact his revenge. And so we don't have to. We can sit back waiting for God to punish them. And I think both fall flat. They fall flat when we consider who Jesus is. Because Jesus, he doesn't say, wait and I'll punish them. Jesus says, no. Love them. Treat your enemies well. Love your enemies. Forgive them. And on the cross, what we see is Jesus, on the cross, he doesn't say, all right, I'm dying now, but you just wait, because I'll get you again. I'll get you later. You'll pay for this sometime. He says, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And when he goes back up to heaven, he tells his disciples, don't wait for me to exact revenge, because that's not going to happen. I don't exact revenge. I want you to be a people who create peace and love and harmony here on earth. You're a people that repair the world. And that's what we should be doing. That's the response we should have to the violence all around us. And that's what John is essentially calling his people to do. A way bigger work, a much harder work. And so in Revelation 5:5, one of my favorite chapters and verses in Revelation, John, he's crying out, just like all of us are doing right now in the midst of all of this turmoil. We cry out and we say, God, where are you? Show us some hope. He says, no one can open up the scroll that shows all of the hope and the plan that you have, the end. Show us the hope. Who can open it? And one of the elders says, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And John says, he turns, he hears of the lion, and he turns and he sees a lamb. What that tells me again is God does not respond beastly to beastly empires. He responds like a lamb, showing love, which is way more compelling than responding through violence and hate, waiting for someone else to kill our enemies. He responds with love. He acts lamb-like. And so it's no wonder in chapter 7, when John describes God's people, it says that John hears an army, 144,000, this military number. He hears of an army, but when he turns, he sees a bunch of worshipers acting lamb-like. And that, in Revelation, is what we learn that God's people are challenged to do. It's a way more difficult process to learn to do. It's easy to respond eye for an eye, but it's way harder to turn the other cheek and say, I forgive you and I wish you well. And so Revelation shows us this beautiful picture of a God that would rather turn his other cheek than respond in violence. And he calls us as God's people to do the same, to show love when our enemies would hate, to show peace and mercy when our enemies would choose violence. That is what the lamb-like life is. It's what Jesus showed us love looks like. May we do the same.